Comrades, hear me when I say, your comfort is a chain, invisible yet suffocating, binding you to a system designed to exploit, deceive, and enslave. Society has taught you to fear upheaval, to cherish your idle ease, to numb yourself with distractions, while the engines of oppression grind your labor into profit for the few. Every cozy chair, every fleeting pleasure, every indulgence in personal security is not a blessing, it is a subtle leash placed upon your hands and mind, ensuring that you remain docile, compliant, and powerless. Understand this. The bourgeoisie, the rulers of capital, have built their empire not through brute force alone, but through your willingness to accept comfort as a substitute for justice. They feed you crumbs, distract you with superficial comforts, and in doing so, they rob you of the fire of discontent, the very force that could ignite the revolution. For in the realm of comfort, no worker questions the legitimacy of his chains. In comfort, the exploited worship the very system that exploits them. Do you not see it? You toil, you labor, you produce worlds of value every day, yet your reward is a mere fraction of your contribution, a meager wage, a hollow promise of security, while the capitalist grows fat on the sweat of your brow. And what do? You settle, you surrender, you trade the power to shape your destiny for the illusion of comfort. This is the triumph of capital. It convinces you to love your servitude, to embrace passivity, to forsake the collective struggle for the sake of ephemeral ease. But let us not be deceived. History is written not by those who sleep comfortably, but by those who rise, who demand, who act. Every epoch of human progress has been forged in the fires of unrest, in the rejection of complacency. The enslaved have never secured their liberation by reclining in the shadow of the oppressor. They have seized it by uniting, by recognizing their common plight, and by declaring with thunderous resolve that they will no longer bow to the dictates of an exploitative system. Comrades, the capitalist teaches you to measure your life in comforts, to value security above justice, and to accept scarcity as natural. But scarcity is not natural, it is imposed. Inequality is not the result of fate, it is the deliberate construction of a ruling class that thrives upon division, that pits worker against worker, that transforms the productive energy of the many into wealth for the few. Comfort is the anesthetic that keeps this structure intact, the lullaby that ensures obedience, the cage in which revolution dies quietly before it is born. To break free, we must first recognize the chains that comfort has forged. We must see that every privilege granted to the few, every safety net that seems to protect us, is in fact a snare designed to prevent collective awakening. We must discard the notion that personal ease is more valuable than collective emancipation. And we must act, for awareness alone achieves nothing. It is only through organized, conscious, and resolute action that society can be transformed. Workers of the world, the time has come to reject the seductive lies of comfort. The struggle is not abstract, it is immediate, urgent, and uncompromising. Unite, for in unity lies the only power capable of toppling the edifices of oppression. Organize, for organization is the weapon with which the exploited reclaim their labor, their dignity, and their lives. Agitate, for agitation awakens consciousness, shatters illusions, and kindles the flame of revolt that cannot be extinguished. You are not meant to live quietly within the margins of a system designed to exploit you. You are not meant to be sedated with comfort while your labor enriches others. The revolution is not a distant dream, it is a living, breathing imperative. To achieve it, we must act where we stand, here and now, casting aside the comforts that lull us into passivity and embracing the struggle that defines our existence. Comrades, comfort is the enemy of change. It is the opiate that keeps you chained, the veil that blinds you to exploitation, and the subtle coercion that ensures the survival of the capitalist order. Rise, therefore, in conscious defiance. Let the unity of the oppressed become the instrument of transformation. Let the organization of the workers become the force that reshapes society. Let the courage to act, the willingness to endure struggle, and the refusal to accept ease at the cost of justice be the hallmark of our age. Change, Real, transformative, historical change is never born of comfort. It is born of struggle, of courage, and of relentless solidarity. The chains of the present can only be broken by the hands of those willing to suffer, to resist, and to rise. The bourgeoisie fears nothing more than the awakening of the many, for in that awakening lies the end of their dominion. Cast off comfort, therefore, comrades. Reject passivity. Embrace the struggle. And in your struggle, claim the world that has always belonged to you. Comfort, that insidious sedative offered by the ruling class, is not a neutral or benign state. It is a deliberate mechanism of control, a tool by which the oppressed are lulled into passivity, while the machinery of exploitation hums relentlessly in the background. It masquerades as well-being, as security, as the fruits of labour earned through diligence and merit, yet it is precisely the opposite. It is a subtle leash, a chain crafted not from iron, but from the illusions of ease, distraction, and temporary satisfaction. The bourgeoisie understands the psychology of submission. They know that a worker who rests comfortably in the shadow of their exploitation is far less likely to question, to resist, or to rise. By offering crumbs of comfort, a stable wage, a modest home, a small distraction, they divert attention from the structural injustice of capitalism, from the theft of labour, from the grotesque inequality that accumulates wealth in the hands of the few, while the many produce, suffer, and survive on the periphery. Comfort functions as a barrier to revolutionary consciousness because it creates the illusion that survival is sufficient, that security is equivalent to freedom. The worker, grateful for a temporary reprieve from hunger, a brief moment of warmth, or a small indulgence purchased by the sweat of their labour, comes to accept the system that enslaves them as natural or even just. This gratitude is dangerous, for it is misdirected. It encourages the mind to rationalize the exploitation, to see the theft of value and dignity not as oppression, but as the inevitable order of things. When comfort is prized above justice, when personal ease is elevated over collective struggle, the oppressed cease to imagine alternatives to the system that governs their lives. The very capacity to recognize injustice is dulled, like a muscle unused, and the spark of rebellion is smothered by the soft pillars of appeasement. The mechanism of comfort is particularly insidious because it disguises itself as choice. Workers are told that they are free to pursue their pleasures, to enjoy the rewards of labour, to cultivate personal happiness. Yet these choices are shallow and circumscribed, preordained within the parameters set by a system designed to extract maximum labour while offering minimal recompense. The illusion of freedom seduces the mind into complacency. The worker believes that they are choosing contentment when in fact they are being conditioned to accept limitation, scarcity, and inequality as the boundaries of life itself. The promise of comfort is a bribe, a way of buying obedience and blunting critical thought, ensuring that the energy which might have fueled collective awakenings instead dissipated in personal gratification, in trivial distraction, in the quiet consumption of what is offered rather than the creation of what is deserved. Moreover, comfort encourages isolation, and isolation is the tool of domination. The system prefers individuals content with their own small gains, unaware of the shared conditions of exploitation that bind them to millions of others. In comfort, the worker is alone, seduced into believing that their struggle is personal, that hardship is an individual burden to bear silently. Solidarity is weakened, awareness of class commonality is eroded, and the capacity for collective action, the only force capable of challenging the power of capital, is delayed or entirely extinguished. The worker, distracted by ease, does not see the structures of power. They do not see that their comfort depends not on fairness, but on continued subjugation and the exploitation of labour. Thus, the ruling class maintains dominance not solely through overt coercion, not only through laws and enforcement, but through the strategic administration of comfort. It is a psychological tool, an economic incentive, and a cultural norm all at once, ensuring that the oppressed are less likely to recognize their condition and less likely to demand transformation. Comfort becomes a narcotic, dulling the senses to injustice, neutralizing the potential for dissent, and making the impossible seem unimaginable. A society in which comfort is prized over consciousness is a society in which oppression can persist indefinitely, where chains remain invisible because the oppressed themselves have been conditioned to embrace them as if they were gifts rather than instruments of control. Revolutionary consciousness, by contrast, requires the rejection of this seduction, the refusal to equate survival with freedom, the awakening to the reality that comfort is not security but subjugation. The worker must learn to see the chains beneath the cushions, to recognize the bribes of ease as tools of the oppressor, to perceive the theft of labor as intolerable rather than inevitable. Only by confronting discomfort, only by enduring the stark truths of exploitation, can the mind be liberated, the imagination of justice be awakened, and the energy of collective struggle be harnessed. Comfort, therefore, is not a neutral or harmless indulgence. It is an instrument of oppression, a pacifier of the oppressed, and a primary barrier to the revolutionary consciousness necessary to overturn the structures of capitalist domination. Capitalism does not merely exploit labor. It is sustained by a deliberate strategy of division and dependency, a system designed to ensure that the working class remains fractured, distracted, and incapable of uniting against those who extract value from their toil. The bourgeoisie understands that the greatest threat to their dominion is the consciousness of the many, the awareness that their labor is the source of wealth, the realization that their shared conditions of exploitation create a common stake in revolution. To prevent this awakening, the capitalist cultivates division between worker and worker, between individual and collective, between desire and reality, always inserting obstacles that prevent unity and solidarity. By keeping the workers focused on superficial ease, on minor comforts, on petty competitions and trivial aspirations, the system ensures that energy, which might have been devoted to collective emancipation, is instead scattered in pursuit of individual security or illusory personal gain. Dependency is the cornerstone of this structure. Workers are taught to rely upon the system that oppresses them, to accept its handouts and conveniences as blessings rather than as tools of control. The wage, the predictable routine, the access to limited leisure, these are not gifts, but mechanisms of psychological capture. They cultivate a dependence on the very structures that exploit, creating a population that fears disruption, that associates challenge with danger rather than liberation. The worker becomes complicit, willingly tethered to the machinery that extracts life from them. Labor while offering in return mere tokens of survival. Dependency erodes initiative, dulls critical faculties, and diverts the mind from contemplating the true nature of exploitation, for it creates a narrative in which comfort appears as reward rather than a bribe, as security rather than subjugation. Division compounds this dependency. The worker is pitted against others, whether through artificial hierarchies, competitive labor markets, or social stratifications deliberately imposed to fragment class consciousness. Each individual is led to see their struggle as personal, their ambitions as solitary, their burdens as unique. Envy, suspicion, and rivalry take the place of solidarity, isolated in pursuit of narrow gain. The worker fails to recognize that their neighbor shares the same chains, that the same system that limits one life also limits all. The ruling class cultivates this separation not as a byproduct, but as a necessity, for a united working class would wield a power capable of dismantling capital itself, a force the bourgeoisie knows they cannot withstand if confronted collectively. By keeping the masses divided, the system neutralizes threat, ensuring that individual grievances dissipate in the vast ocean of fragmentation. Superficial ease is the instrument that lubricates this division. Small pleasures, minor indulgences, and trivial conveniences are strategically distributed to distract attention from systemic exploitation. The worker is seduced by the illusion that a slightly higher wage, a marginally better product, or the appearance of upward mobility is sufficient reward for a lifetime of labor. These distractions are carefully calibrated. They are enough to create contentment, but never sufficient to inspire questioning, never enough to spark the awareness that true justice is collective rather than individual, structural rather than personal. Ease, therefore, functions as both carrot and cage, offering the semblance of satisfaction while masking the conditions that perpetuate dependence and division. Education, culture, and media are enlisted in this endeavor, producing narratives that reinforce competition, normalize inequality, and glorify consumption as the ultimate aspiration. The worker learns to measure success in relative comfort, to accept hierarchy as natural, to equate survival with progress. These ideological reinforcements strengthen the walls that separate the many from their power, ensuring that even when conditions are intolerable, the response is fragmented and ineffectual. The worker becomes a passive participant in a system designed to exploit them, satisfied with tokens, while the wealth they create accumulates elsewhere. The consequence of this strategy is that capitalism sustains itself not only through extraction but through deception. It relies on the erosion of collective consciousness, the cultivation of dependency, and the maintenance of division. Workers are discouraged from perceiving themselves as part of a class, from recognizing their shared interests, from understanding that the true enemy is structural rather than individual. Only by breaking these bonds of division, by rejecting the superficial ease that pacifies and distracts, can the working class reclaim its potential, awaken to its power, and confront the system that profits from fragmentation. Thus, capitalism thrives not simply because it seizes wealth, but because it ensures that the very population whose labor sustains it remains divided, distracted and dependent, incapable of turning their collective strength into revolutionary action. The strategy is subtle yet relentless, embedded in every institution, every incentive, every comfort that appears benign but serves the interests of the few at the expense of the many, ensuring that domination continues unchallenged. Unless the workers recognize the chains of division and dependency and unite to break them. True liberation is not a gift bestowed by the benevolence of those in power, nor is it the passive accumulation of personal comforts or fleeting freedoms. It is the result of collective struggle, the deliberate, organized, and conscious action of those who understand that their fate is inseparable from the fate of the class to which they belong. The working class, the oppressed, the exploited, cannot achieve emancipation as isolated individuals, for capitalism and its structures of domination are designed to fragment, to distract, and to neutralize solitary resistance. Freedom is not the product of accident, charity, or gradual reform. It is the product of conscious unity, of deliberate organization, and of action that is guided by an awareness of systemic oppression and the shared conditions of exploitation. Without this understanding, without this coordination, the power of the many remains dormant, scattered, and ineffectual, and the machinery of oppression continues unchallenged. Unity is the first and indispensable pillar of liberation. To be united is not merely to gather in numbers, but to recognize the fundamental bonds that tie the oppressed together, to perceive that their struggles are shared, their labor collectively exploited, their suffering systemic rather than personal. It is the understanding that the wealth of the few is inseparable from the toil of the many, that the privileges of the elite are secured by the submission and division of the masses, and that no individual effort can dismantle a system that relies upon collective exploitation. Unity creates strength, transforming isolated grievances into shared purpose, fear into courage, passivity into momentum. It is through unity that the exploited become aware of their collective power, the latent force capable of challenging and overturning the structures of domination. But unity alone is insufficient if it is not paired with organization. Conscious coordination transforms energy into action. Organization is the vessel through which unity is channeled into effective strategies, tactics, and campaigns capable of confronting systemic injustice. It is not enough to recognize oppression. recognition must be translated into coherent action, into structures that allow workers to coordinate demands, to defend each other, to confront the institutions and mechanisms that perpetuate inequality. Organization equips the oppressed with tools to resist, to negotiate, to challenge the power of capital not in fragmented bursts, but as a sustained and coherent force. It enables the many to act as one, to mobilize resources, to strategize with foresight, and to wield their collective strength in ways that cannot be ignored or dismissed by the ruling class. Without organization, unity remains abstract, a sentiment rather than a weapon, and the potential for liberation is squandered. Conscious action, the third pillar, is what transforms awareness and structure into liberation. It is the deliberate choice to act in accordance with the understanding of systemic oppression, to refuse the passivity that comfort and fear impose, and to engage in struggle with purpose and clarity. Conscious action is informed by knowledge of history, by awareness of class relations, by the recognition that power is never surrendered voluntarily, and that change is the result of sustained effort and strategic confrontation. It requires courage, discipline, and a refusal to accept the illusions of ease and reform that capitalism deploys to maintain its dominance. Action without consciousness risks chaos. Consciousness without action results in stagnation. Only when the two are united does the oppressed possess the means to transform society, to dismantle the institutions of exploitation, and to seize control over the labor and wealth that rightfully belong to them. The historical record bears witness to this truth. No emancipatory movement has succeeded through individual effort alone. Revolutions have been won not by isolated acts of heroism, but by the collective awareness and organized action of the masses. Every victory over tyranny, every advance in the cause of justice, has been the result of solidarity and coordination, of groups that recognize their common purpose and act with deliberate intention. Conversely, when movements lack unity, when they are poorly organized or fail to act consciously, the forces of oppression exploit division, scatter resistance, and maintain domination. This is the lesson of every struggle, and it underscores the necessity of linking unity, organization, and conscious action as inseparable pillars of liberation. True liberation demands that the oppressed see beyond individual circumstances, beyond immediate personal gain, to the broader struggle of the class as a whole. It demands that they recognize their shared conditions and transform them into collective strength. It demands that awareness be converted into strategy, solidarity into structure, and courage into sustained effort. Only through this triad of unity, organization, and conscious action can the power of the many confront and overturn the structures of exploitation, reclaim the value of labor, and construct a society where wealth, opportunity, and dignity are not privileges hoarded by the few, but rights enjoyed by all. Historical change is never the product of complacency, nor does it emerge from those content to live within the narrow confines of security provided by the ruling class. It is forged in the crucible of struggle, in the confrontation between the oppressed and the forces that exploit them, in the relentless efforts of those who refuse to accept the legitimacy of a system that thrives upon inequality. The notion that life can be transformed while one remains comfortably passive is a myth propagated by the very architects of oppression. Capitalism and all forms of social hierarchy that benefit from exploitation present security as a substitute for freedom, comfort as a substitute for justice, and conformity as a substitute for consciousness. Those who settle for these illusions are complicit in their own subjugation. They become spectators in a drama of exploitation in which they are central participants, yet fail to recognize their role in sustaining the system. Security, in the capitalist sense, is always conditional, always dependent on the acquiescence of the oppressed. The worker who believes in the stability of wage, contract, or social position is deceived, for these structures are not guarantees of liberty but instruments of control. They ensure predictability in labor, consistency in output, and the maintenance of hierarchy. The illusion of security is a cage in which the mind grows accustomed to limits, the imagination of justice atrophies, and the capacity for dissent is dulled. It is within this illusion that history stagnates. For those who value comfort over challenge, safety over struggle, and stability over emancipation, fail to confront the systemic forces that dictate their lives. Security without struggle is a mirage. It appears to shelter the individual while it simultaneously reinforces the power of the few over the many. Struggle, by contrast, is the engine of historical transformation. It is the confrontation with reality that awakens consciousness, sharpens the intellect, and reveals the mechanisms of exploitation. Through struggle, the oppressed come to understand not only the conditions that bind them, but the collective power that resides in their unity. Every act of resistance, whether it is a demand for fair wages, the formation of associations, or the refusal to accept unjust labor practices, is a step toward breaking the chains that constrain the many for the benefit of the few. History is replete with evidence that no significant transformation occurs without sustained struggle. Revolutions, reform movements, and social awakenings all share a common origin in the dissatisfaction, courage, and persistent action of those who refuse to be placated by comfort or lulled by false security. The ruling class, acutely aware of this, invests heavily in creating distractions and diversions that pacify and fragment the oppressed. Comfort is deployed strategically, whether through material concessions, ideological persuasion, or social amenities that occupy attention and energy. These measures are not benevolent. They are designed to forestall struggle, to delay awakening, and to ensure that the potential for collective action remains dormant. They encourage individuals to accept minor advantages in exchange for submission, to view incremental gains as victories rather than as an adequate compensation for systemic injustice. By keeping the oppressed occupied with survival and superficial satisfaction, the system neutralizes the forces that could generate meaningful historical change. True historical transformation requires more than awareness of exploitation. It demands the courage to act upon that awareness. It demands confrontation with discomfort, the willingness to risk security, and the capacity to endure the inevitable hardships that arise when challenging entrenched power. The path of revolution is arduous because it is opposed by those who benefit from the status quo, yet it is precisely in these struggles that consciousness is sharpened and collective strength is forged. Each act of defiance, each refusal to accept the authority of capital, each initiative taken in solidarity with others builds momentum, creating conditions under which historical change becomes possible. Complacency, even under the guise of security, is therefore a barrier to progress, while struggle is the vehicle through which societies are reshaped and oppression is dismantled. History teaches that security is never the precursor to freedom, it is often its impediment. Those who seek to wait for safe conditions, for favorable circumstances, or for the consent of the powerful surrender the initiative and allow the system to perpetuate itself. Liberation is never granted, it must be seized, fought for, and defended. The oppressed, when they recognize that comfort and security are insufficient substitutes for justice, begin to act collectively, strategically and deliberately. Through struggle, they reclaim agency over their labor, dignity and lives. And in doing so, they transform not only themselves, but the structure of society itself. Change is born in action, nurtured in conflict, and sustained by the courage to endure, persist, and resist. Rejecting comfort is not a mere moral exhortation. It is an imperative for those who seek to reclaim the full measure of their labor, dignity, and societal power. Comfort, as offered by the capitalist system, is a calculated sedative, a pacifier designed to keep the oppressed bound to a life of subordination while the few extract wealth and influence from their toil. To embrace comfort is to accept the conditions of exploitation as tolerable, to consent to the extraction of one as labor without resistance, and to forfeit the possibility of true freedom. The worker who values ease over justice allows the machinery of domination to operate unchallenged, and in doing so surrenders agency, surrendering the very power inherent in collective labor and shared struggle. Rejection of comfort, therefore, is not asceticism. It is a conscious act of defiance, a refusal to be sedated by crumbs while the fruits of one, as labor are seized and hoarded by others. Labor, in a capitalist society, is transformed into a commodity, stripped of its intrinsic value and alienated from the worker who produces it. The worker, as energy, creativity, and time are converted into wealth for the few, while the worker themselves receives only a fraction in exchange for the totality of their contribution. Comfort conceals this theft, creating a sense of satisfaction with the bare minimum and discouraging the recognition of exploitation. By rejecting comfort, the worker sharpens their perception of injustice, recognizes the true value of their labor, and refuses to accept the diminishment of their own effort. Rejection of comfort becomes a reclamation of self-respect and dignity, an acknowledgement that labor is not a means to meek survival, but a source of power, a vehicle for transformation, and the foundation upon which the oppressed may assert their rightful control over society. Dignity, long eroded by dependency, division, and passivity, is restored only when comfort is discarded as a measure of life. Those who cling to ease allow the illusion of security to define their existence, and in doing so, permit their sense of worth to be dictated by the system that exploits them. To reject comfort is to declare that one's life, work, and humanity are not negotiable, that submission to superficial ease is unacceptable, and that the worth of a human being cannot be measured by the concessions offered by the ruling class. It is in the refusal of comfort that the oppressed assert moral and existential agency, signaling that their labor, intelligence, and energy are not mere tools for accumulation by others, but instruments of self-determination, collective empowerment, and societal transformation. Societal power is inseparable from the recognition and assertion of collective labor and collective rights. The capitalist system is structured to concentrate power in the hands of a few, to ensure that wealth and influence flow upward, while the majority remain constrained within structures of compliance and passivity. Comfort perpetuates this imbalance by inducing acquiescence, dividing the oppressed into isolated units satisfied with small privileges, and discouraging the unification necessary for meaningful challenge. By rejecting comfort, individuals reject the passive acceptance of these arrangements, choosing instead to engage in collective organization, deliberate action, and strategic resistance. The reclamation of societal power requires the courage to endure struggle, the clarity to understand systemic exploitation, and the willingness to forego transient ease for the possibility of lasting justice. This rejection is not symbolic, it is practical, operational, and transformative. Every moment in which the worker refuses to be seduced by comfort is a moment in which energy is redirected toward collective awakening, towards resistance, and toward the construction of alternatives to capitalist domination. It sharpens consciousness, strengthens solidarity, and cultivates the discipline necessary for organized, effective action. Comfort may lull the body, but it numbs the mind. Rejection of comfort awakens both, transforming latent potential into force capable of reshaping society, reclaiming labor, and asserting the dignity and rights of the oppressed. To reject comfort is to recognize that the struggle for justice is not compatible with passivity, that liberation cannot be purchased with security, and that societal transformation demands the full engagement of those whose labor sustains the world. It is to acknowledge that dignity is inseparable from resistance, that power is inseparable from organization, and that the reclamation of one's own life, work, and community is contingent upon courage, discipline, and refusal. Comfort is the barrier, struggle is the path. By rejecting comfort, the oppressed reclaim what is theirs by right, control over labor, restoration of dignity, and the capacity to shape society according to principles of equality, justice, and collective empowerment. Comrades, the path to liberation is clear, and the lessons of history are undeniable. Comfort is not a blessing, it is a chain. Security without struggle is an illusion. Division and dependency are the tools by which the few maintain power over the many. True freedom, the reclamation of labor, dignity, and societal power, can only be achieved through unity, through deliberate organization, and through conscious, relentless action. The worker who clings to comfort preserves their own subjugation. The worker who confronts injustice with courage awakens not only themselves but the entire class to its potential. The time for hesitation is past. The illusions of security, the seductions of ease, and the distractions of division are the very instruments that maintain oppression. Reject them, cast them aside. Recognize that your labor is your power, your unity is your weapon, and your consciousness is the spark that can ignite transformation. Together, the oppressed possess the means to overthrow exploitation, to dismantle the structures of inequality, and to build a society where wealth, dignity, and justice belong to all, not a privileged few. Let this truth guide our struggle. Historical change emerges only from action, only from confrontation with injustice, only from the refusal to accept the conditions imposed upon us. Comfort is the enemy of change, but struggle, solidarity, and consciousness are its liberation. Rise, organize, act, and in your collective courage, reclaim the world that has always belonged to you.